Good day, friends. Welcome to the latest, after many months of inaction, um, on the video series Average Folks in the Afterlife. Now, today I'm going to be focusing on the work and inner journey of David Spangler, a teacher, a mystic, teacher, educator, who's been quite influential in my own journey, and certainly going all the way back to the 70s when his association with the Findhorn experiment in Scotland brought a number of his books into circulation, including one that I was very influenced by. I'll just show it to you. Reflections on the Christ. There were several others, but this one was of particular interest to me. And, whereas the Findhorn people generally were more focused on communicating with devas and nature spirits of various kinds in order to co-create a marvelous garden. Conscious co-creation, they were a fine example of that and inspired many others, including myself, although all I did was work on my back garden, and that's quite recently. But it was always in the back of my mind that he was a profound influence upon me, and as well as many other things, theosophy, spiritualism, etc., etc. And more recently, I've delved back into his work, and for example, Subtle Worlds, A Field Explorer's Notes, and Apprenticed to Spirit, The Education of a Soul. Somewhat autobiographical, as you can well imagine, and detailing his mystical experiences and his interaction with his spirit guide, who famously liked to be called John. Nothing fancy. Now, I'm going to read from this because there's some very interesting experiences here, mystical experiences and trips into afterlife realms. And if I can't get it to all of it today, we'll do a part 2 fairly soon. And as for others, this started in childhood. David was a natural mystic, a natural seer of auras, a natural intuitive, and fortunately blessed with understanding parents, and later on sympathetic friends. And this first experience, I think, was about 7 years old, and his father had been given a job in Morocco, of all places, even though he's American by birth. And you'll get the reference to Casablanca. One morning we were driving into Casablanca. I was in the back seat of our car watching the scenery go by. Passing a tiny stream that flowed alongside the road in what was little more than a deep ditch at the foot of a small bluff, we saw a group of Arab women standing in the water, washing their clothes the way they had done since the days of Abraham, by beating them against the rocks. As I watched them, I noticed a large billboard set into a bluff overhead and looked out the back window to see what it said. It showed a glamorous blonde woman's smiling face next to a large bottle of Nehi, a popular orange soda. For reasons I no longer remember, I had been thinking about the riddles of existence. Why was I here? Where did I come from? Who was I? As I looked up at the Nehi sign with the Arab women working below, I remember asking myself, who was I before I was David Spangler? Who am I who is looking at this sign? As if this question had been a key, I suddenly felt something open inside of me. I felt myself swelling as if I were a balloon and something were pumping air into me. And I found myself floating like a balloon above our family car, looking down. Through the roof of the car, I could see my parents in the front seat and my own body sitting in the back. Then I was immersed in light, as if I had entered an illuminated cloud. I seemed to expand, taking more and more of this light into myself. I moved through layers that alternated between sensation and light. I would have moments of seeing, sometimes landscapes, sometimes just patterns of color or energy, to re-enter a region of only light, which in turn gave way to different perspectives. As I went through these layers, I had an experience of expanding awareness and knowledge. At one point, I came out of the light to a place in which I was surrounded by a circle of figures, all of which were familiar to me as parts of myself. I had the impression of I was seeing past and future lives. At that moment, I knew who I was as a soul and consciousness that existed before my life as David. I was filled with a sense of awakening and remembrance. I remember thinking, this is what an amnesiac experiences when he remembers who he is. This was accompanied by an intense feeling of relief and joy. The movement returned to a layer of pure light. It felt as if I were rushing onward, outward, into an ever larger space, until the light parted, and I found myself looking out on the universe with a great spiral galaxy directly before me, pulsing with a golden light and vibrating with life and power. I felt I was not looking at stars, but at a living organism, a cosmic body, a body of which I was a part. At that moment, my sense of being a separate human individual faded to a feeling of union with universal presence. The light closed in around me again, and I was aware of a reverse movement of contracting and consolidating. I felt myself going through stages of becoming a particular individual again. I felt something calling me, but not from somewhere outside of me. It was coming from within me as a will and a desire that was focused upon the earth. Again, I burst out of the light and found myself looking down upon the earth from space, as if from near orbit. It looked exactly as it does in pictures the astronauts have taken, all blue and white and exquisitely beautiful. I felt an outpouring of love for this planet and a sense of joy that I could become part of it. I felt a strong desire to dive into the world, as if being a part of it was the most wonderful and exciting thing imaginable. I heard someone call my name, David Spangler. I was filled with a will to be this unique, specific person, and in a burst of joy, I leapt forward toward the new world and found myself back in my body, looking out the rear window of our car at the billboard of the blonde woman. In my body's time, I had been gone for only a few seconds. In some ways, this was a classic mystical experience of unity with a larger state of being and an awakening to one's eternal self, the I that is within each of us. I felt I had returned to a place I had come from and then traced the process by which I came to be who I am as a physical individuality. Years later, the memory and details of this experience became the starting point from which I shaped my understanding of the process and of incarnation, an understanding that is the heart of much of my current work. What happens after you have an experience of this nature? In my case, what happened next was that we continued our drive into Casablanca and went shopping. I remember sitting in the car, definitely feeling very different from how I had felt a moment before. I felt more me, more myself, more present and alive than I had before this experience happened. Nothing felt strange about it at all. To find myself out of my body and flowing into a state of cosmic consciousness was simply another part of life's wonder revealing itself to me, part of the whole magical life I was experiencing in Moscow. It never occurred to me to question it. Why would I? You don't question what's happened when you wake up in the morning and remember who you are and who you were before you went to sleep. It's just part of the natural cycle of life. As far as I knew, this is what happened when a person turned 7. You woke up to your larger self. Experience number 1. Many pages go by, and another fairly profound experience occurs. I think this one is sort of high school teenager-ish. That's when I had the vision that ultimately changed everything. Like my experience at age 7, it began in a wholly innocuous way. It was a gorgeous summer's day, not too hot, and I had decided to walk downtown from our apartment, a distance of 3 or 4 miles. En route, I passed the home of one of my parents' friends, who happened to see me and invited me in for a lemonade. As we sat together, she asked a perfectly normal question, the kind of adults always ask of teenagers about to go to college. Now that you're off to college, what do you plan to do with your life? My stock answer was, well, I plan to do research in molecular biology and genetics. That was usually enough to satisfy the questioner and shift the conversation to other topics. But this time something very different happened. There were no bells or whistles. There was no out-of-body flight or any sensations of entering an altered state of consciousness. There was nothing as dramatic as what had happened when I was 7. I only saw a human figure appear in front of me. This was not a specific person, but a generic individual, almost like a department store mannequin. It was not a being of light, as I was used to seeing, but seemed sculpted from light that glowed from within itself. It definitely appeared solid and physical, even though radiant with light. It seemed bursting with meaning, so much so that if information were heat and light, it would seem that this individual was standing in front of a furnace. I felt overwhelmed by the insights this figure contained and could not grasp them all. Almost 50 years later, I am still unpacking the information it had to offer. That reminds me of taking psychedelics 50 years ago. I'm still unpacking some of the insights I got, or ruminating on them, or comparing them to, how shall we say, naturally occurring mystical experiences. But one thing stood out. This figure represented an incarnate person in a physical embodiment. It was neither a spiritual nor a non-physical being. It was not an image of what a person might become if he or she left the physical plane or became some kind of ascended master. It was an image of the spiritual light contained within and radiating from the act of individuation and personhood. It was the light of being a person. As I watched, the figure changed into a chalice and then became a figure again. It did this 3 times altogether, as if emphasizing that this person also represented a quality of holding. Afterward, I thought of this figure as the person who is also the chalice. At the same time this vision unfolded in front of me, I sensed the presence of a group of inner beings in the background, one of whom came to stand behind me. He said quite distinctly, "There is a new spirituality emerging. The spirituality of personhood and incarnation. It will represent a new way of being in the world." And then he said, "Your work is to help with this emergence." And then the vision faded. The whole experience probably did not take more than a minute or two. I shared this experience with my friend. As a woman with a long history of metaphysical practice and psychic exploration, she responded as if what had happened were quite ordinary. She simply laughed and said, "Well, I guess that answers my question. I think you're supposed to be a spiritual teacher." That was when he was 17. Um, his spirit guide John, who's been introduced by this point, one of the exercises he gets him to do is to try and love objects. Something as simple as a paperclip, believe it or not. And and obviously it leads to greater things, more challenging experiences. For example, in that moment, I felt the love for the paperclip or the stone or whatever I happened to be holding for the exercise, but no longer as an object separate from myself. It wasn't so much that the object and I became one, but that we became transparent to each other, as if the boundaries surrounding and defining each of us had expanded to include the other. I felt more whole in myself, more fully part of a larger wholeness. And as John had said, in that moment the love and spirit within the world became more real, more apparent, more accessible. It was dropping into this larger wholeness that John had wanted me to experience. For him, love meant more than just a relationship. It was the opening of a portal to the presence of the sacred, the lover of all creation. The exercises became more challenging. One that stands out for me occurred early, nearly a year after we'd started to work together. I happened to be watching the local news on television. A man had been arrested for raping and sexually mutilating a young boy. Seeing the man on the screen as he was brought into court, I was filled with anger and loathing. Not only was his act heinous, but he was one of the ugliest men I'd ever seen. A thin fellow with a narrow, pinched face who looked more rat than human. As I sat there watching this man being arraigned before a judge, John showed up and said, "I have a task for you. I want you to love this man for whom you currently feel such hatred and anger. I want you to find that place in you where you can embrace him as your brother and hold him with compassion and love." Naturally, given this task, my loathing for this man leapt up even more. "But John," I said, "this man is a monster. And would you cast him out?" "And you would cast him out. I understand. But God does not cast him out. I would like you to discover how God can do this. You are not sanctioning what he has done by loving him. You are keeping open the door for his liberation and transformation in the future." How could I refuse? I set about working to love this man. At first, just thinking about him was painful. He became part of my daily meditation on love. Whatever exercise I was doing on loving, or if I was spending time in contemplation of the love that God has for all beings and all creation, I would end that exercise or contemplation picturing this man in my mind and holding him in the loving, compassionate feelings I had been generating in myself. On the one hand, I had to confront my hatred and anger at him for what he had done. Emotions I felt were probably unbecoming to an apprentice spiritual teacher, but which at the same time seemed fully justified. And on the other hand, I had to hold him in my heart. In the process, I discovered these tasks were two sides of the same coin. I had to hold and love myself, even though I was feeling anger and loathing. And I had to hold and love him, even though he was a perpetrator of a horrendous deed. In the process, I began to more fully appreciate how the sacred holds and loves all of us in spite of what we do. If God can forgive and have compassion for us, I thought, surely we can forgive and have compassion for each other. But John, who was monitoring my progress with all of this, added thoughts of his own. "This is not about forgiveness. I am not asking you to forgive him for his actions or yourself for your emotional reactions. I am asking you to love." There is a difference. Forgiveness liberates you, but love liberates everyone. Good point. His soul suffers, for no soul intends to increase suffering in the world. The psyche must learn now to untwist itself, reform itself, heal itself, and come again into alignment with his soul. This will take work on his part. That work can be supported by love, but it can be obstructed and complicated by energies and thoughts of hatred and fear. Think of trying to clear a house of clutter. Love opens up the doors and windows, letting in fresh air, and it creates a space for the clutter to be organized, sorted, and disposed of. Hatred, fear, and anger only add more clutter, forcing the doors and windows closed in self-protection and self-loathing. Eventually, I was able to love this man. I found a place of compassion in my heart where I could think of him as a brother and hold him in blessing. I realized I could not cast him out without separating myself from the love that embraces all of us all the time. I could see the constrictions and distortions in his energy. Finally, I stopped thinking about him and was just present to him. Without excusing anything that he had done, I simply held him in my heart. I could feel both of us being embraced in love. This love offered a space in which anger and judgment gave way to compassion, and my own energy projected toward him could serve a cause of healing rather than condemnation. Incidents like these, in which John asked me to work on my own emotional and mental states, developing my capacities for love and compassion, were an integral part of my apprenticeship. This may not be what a person would expect as a part of training in clairvoyance and working with the inner worlds. But John was very clear that all inner work had to be grounded on a moral foundation. It had to be rooted in love. This particular exercise was challenging for me since sexual predation, especially against children, is one of the worst crimes I can think of. But John didn't stop there. He would often just pick someone at random whom I had met and ask me to love that person. Indeed, reminds me of a couple of things. Very early on in my series of YouTube videos, you have to go way back to the beginning. It's like within the first 20. Just go back, get on the video list and go backwards in time. And you'll find a not very well recorded video on unconditional love. Recorded in a Starbucks near where I live. And I'm sitting by the window and talking about, projecting unconditional love to anybody around you. And I remember the video because, well, it's poorly recorded. The mic wasn't very good. But you can sort of hear me, but there's background Starbucks noise, even though the place was half empty. But there's an amusing moment when I'm by the window and a car comes up on the sidewalk behind, and there's this little ballet of as a young child gets out of the car. And it just strikes me as a sort of a little ballet because the child is so unconscious of what of being a little star in a little movie. And one memory. Another memory is a number of times I have tried to get clients who come to me for advice and help to use the force of unconditional love. And I show them how to do it and I explain how to do it. Even this goes back many years. And often it's with co-workers that they have trouble getting along with. And, situations like that, maybe someone in the family. And I explain to them that using the force of unconditional love doesn't mean you have to actually like the person. You may never really like them very much, but you can help them with their own journey and make them into a more harmonious being by projecting unconditional love to them. Because it just it gives them something unconsciously, and the resistance that they may have to the the sort of kindness of unconditional love, the mercy of unconditional love, is not activated. Your resistance will not be activated. And so I could advise you to do the same. you can always use the energy of unconditional love. All you have to do is recognize that it's there in the universe and can be employed. You don't have to actually be Christ-like yourself, although it helps. um, Spangler talks about spirits as inner beings quite often. When it came to learning about the inner realms themselves, John would at times simply give me information to questions I might ask, but this was rare. His approach was, as much as possible, to have me see or experience something for myself and form my own conclusions. Sometimes he would bring an inner being and a pattern of subtle energies to me and have me look at it clairvoyantly and feel its energy in my body. It was an exercise in tuning in to energy and presence. Nor was this mainly a psychic exercise. Pay attention to the felt sense in your body, John would say. What do you feel and where do you feel it? What sensations are in your body when you attune to this energy or being? You are a spectrum of consciousness, he once said. You are not a soul in a body like a driver in a car. You, like everyone, are more like a string that has been tied into a series of knots. Each knot is a mode of consciousness. You look at the knots and say, I am this body, I am this soul. But in truth, you are the string. I find this a very good metaphor. It reminds me of, the string comes down from the higher self, and, your presence in the mental realms, the causal realms, the astral realms are like the knots on the string, with the being on the physical plane as maybe the bottom knot. But you're all connected by the string. I find that very useful. From John's perspective, it was ultimately the string that perceived, the string that discerned, the string that had consciousness. Over the years, he brought a variety of beings and other forces for me to experience. His approach was really that of a naturalist bringing samples from the ecology for me to look at in order to gain an understanding of that ecology as a whole. This had been my approach as well. An angel for John was not a religious figure, for example, but a class of being, a particular type of life within which we were various species. His approach was not so much to teach me about each specific type of being to whom he introduced me, but to give me an overall sense of the inner worlds as a kind of ecology in which I would have to exercise my inner perceptions and discernments. Once he appeared and said, I have someone for you to meet. His name is Michael, and he will help if you run into energies or situations that are difficult. Think of him as a protector or a guardian, although that is not all that he is. He's not directly part of the inner school I work with, but he is connected. How he is connected and what more there is about him is for you to discern and discover. John stepped back out of my energy field and Michael came forward. Rather than being a cloud of swirling energies and an amorphous figure, which is how I generally see inner beings, Michael was a young-looking man dressed in a light brown suit and a tan, almost a golden shirt, with an open collar and no tie. As John requested, I tuned into Michael's energy and felt something curious, different from what I'd felt before. It was as if he were at one end of a very long tube, while the main part of him was elsewhere. I could feel great power around him, but not entirely in the figure before him. I mentioned this and Michael said, You're right. I am a projection. I'm a representative of a larger being. I looked more closely and tried to follow the line of energy I felt back to its source. All I could feel at the time was a source of great light and power, a bit like looking at a distant sun. I could feel its radiance, its love, but also a strong quality that I interpreted as will. When I remarked on this, Michael said, You would know this source as the Archangel Michael. whose name I bear because I am part of him. Later, John said, it is not uncommon for certain planetary and cosmic beings to project representatives of themselves and of their energies, like cells from a larger body, in a form that is more easily engaged by the recipient. Understand as well that Michael is his name only in certain traditions. It is the name by which you would be familiar with him. As a planetary presence, he is known in different ways and by different names in different cultures. In this case, this cell presents himself to you because Michael is one who overlights the greater work of which our school is a part. He is not directly engaged in the experiments and explorations we are conducting with you, but he is a sponsor, so to speak. He is the planetary being most engaged with the transformational possibilities and energies now at work in your world, as well as with the challenges they bring. It's important for you to become familiar with his energy so that you can attune to it. And there is one energy in particular that he offers to our school and to the work we do. Please seek to discern what that is. Well, Archangel Michael in a brown suit with a tan shirt. That reminds me of, and maybe you, if you've read the book, More Adventures in Eternity. When I first contacted or felt myself in contact with the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, I definitely had a sense, or I was told, I think I was told, that what I was seeing and feeling was only a part of the fuller being. And if I was to perceive or feel the full being of the Buddha, it would overwhelm me. And I understood that. And certainly in contacts with Jesus Christ, it was much the same experience, or the feeling that I had, that I was seeing a representative, a projection. I don't think I used the word projection, but I did sort of use the word representative. And and they could make many projections simultaneously. Planetary cosmic beings can do that, which I think is why many people can be feeling that they're in contact with Jesus Christ and at the same time. How many they can do, I do not know. And I wouldn't care to guess, but more than 10 or 20, I would think. Yes, definitely an agreement there. That's how I experience those beings. And I did try to represent this in the novel, An American in Heaven, where Melanie, the heroine, takes her place in a mass sighting of the figure of Jesus coming down from the sky as a radiant being, rather like the Fatima experiences of many years ago here on Earth. I do try to represent these things in as many modalities as I can, because each part of the audience has its preferences. And certainly I hope you have, some of you have a preference for this David Spangler series. There'll definitely be one more, maybe even two. He has a number of fascinating experiences that he relates in his books. And we'll get to part 2 very soon. And there are more sort of trips into the afterlife realms. Consider this an introduction to them. And until then, so long, my friends.